Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, with news of a budget surplus, the governor and lawmakers weigh in. The State Economist explains the numbers, and the Senate Finance Chair offers perspective on past and future spending. Stay tuned for this and more on this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. The latest budget and economic forecast was recently released, projecting a budget surplus of $1.3 billion with $2.3 billion in the budget reserve. We begin this week with reactions from Governor Walz and legislative leaders.
Minnesota's economy is working because Minnesotans are working, and it's working because we've made smart budgeting decisions. We've been disciplined. We've kept our eye on the long term and invested in the things that make our state grow. This last legislative session, we invested in our children's education. We protected Minnesota's access to affordable health care. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, 1.36 million middle-class Minnesotans will see a tax rate cut. Clearly, this responsible approach to budgeting does work. We're in a healthy economic position, and we need to protect that.
This is good news in numbers, but it really tells a tale of two Minnesotas. While simultaneously our budget is bringing in more revenue, or our state is bringing in more revenue than planned, and our economic forecast is better than expected, we are also a state that is dealing with record racial disparities, with rising homelessness, unaffordable housing, unaffordable health care, and challenges for Minnesotans who are working full-time or more than full-time to make enough money in order to support themselves and their families.
I appreciate very much the spirit from Governor Walz in terms of working together and trying to figure out solutions that do work. I especially appreciated his comments and Majority Leader Winkler's in talking about the effect of inflation, because that is real. And actually, we've been talking about this for several years in our caucus, that when you look into the out years, the picture becomes not so rosy. And the question was brought up about the surplus and the perception of the surplus, because it is a lot of money. But when I talk to people in my community about that, I often make the analogy that a surplus, if it's one-time money, is like getting a really good annual bonus at work. You have that and you can use it, but you're not going to go out and get a new mortgage with that. If you get a raise in your salary, that's ongoing money that you can bank on and you can plan for.
If you look at the economic report, it shows that the next 4 years we're going to have some growth, so not into a recession. So that is really, really good news. Well, that's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, I want to say the Trump tax cuts and the tax cuts we've done the last two budget cycles are working. They are spurring growth. That's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. And so the overall message for us is that we funded our priorities. Last budget cycle, we were generous in funding our priorities, education and every other agency. And the savings account is full. That's our budget reserves. This is the first time we've ever reached the ceiling, that we're full. And let me say about that this is bipartisan. That's something that we're all worked on. We know that you never know what the future is. That's why you have budget reserves. But the fact that they're full and that they've reached the ceiling is really good news for Minnesota. So the final thing is it's time to give the rest back.
I think this is actually great news for Minnesota. It shows that we've got a healthy, strong, vibrant economy. Revenues continue to come in over projections. I think those are all really good things. And I think it puts us in a great position. Obviously, this last session, we set a budget. I and the minority wasn't as involved in that as I would have liked to have been, but the majority parties set a budget for this state and invested in the priorities that I think we all can agree on. Now this gives us an opportunity to say, what do we do with this extra money? Because obviously we've got more money coming in than we need. In the last election, the #1 issue was healthcare costs. In the next election, I predict the #1 issue will be healthcare costs. I think the best thing we can do is use this money to directly reduce healthcare costs for every Minnesotan.
Joining me now to provide some analysis of the economic projections is the state's economist, Dr. Laura Kalambokidis. Welcome.
Thank you.
This is now the longest economic expansion in history, and the state is projected to have a budget surplus of $1.3 billion. Also noteworthy is that the budget reserve has reached its statutory capacity at $2.3 billion. Is this good news?
Yes, it's very good news. It's great that Minnesota's steady economic performance is continuing, even as the U.S. expansion has surpassed record length. So that's very good news. To extend this expansion longer is great. The budget reserve is good news for Minnesota because we're surely closer to the next recession than we are to the last. And so when the economic downturn occurs, it will be really valuable to have that reserve filled up so that the state can continue to provide services that are going to be needed as revenue growth slows in a recession.
The outlook has improved since the last forecast in February, with continued GDP growth for the next 4 years. What contributed to the slightly improved outlook in GDP?
Yeah, so the GDP outlook is slightly improved. That is due to some offsetting effects in a couple of components of GDP. So the consumer spending forecast has increased. And this is the U.S. consumer spending forecast, and that is higher because incomes are higher, because household wealth has been growing. If you think about in the U.S., most people's sources of wealth are their homes and savings, for instance, retirement savings, stock portfolios, and both of those things have been growing. And when household wealth increases, when people feel wealthier, they spend more. And that additional spending forecast has been supported also by improved employment outlook for the U.S. Now that offsets a lowered outlook on the business side. So business investment, that forecast is lower than it was in February, and business investment is forecast to slow down.
So I had the question, the thing about consumer spending is experts believe it will continue, and you've explained that. The forecast also predicts that real wages will exceed the rate of inflation. So how is that possible? I mean, because if we keep having money, we'll keep spending it. Why the belief that will be true?
Yeah, so in our Minnesota forecast in particular, we have average wages per worker growing at a rate that exceeds the rate of inflation, which means that real wages will improve. And the reason for that in Minnesota is that we have a tight labor market here. So we have very strong demand for labor, and we have some restrictions on supply of labor as the population ages and as baby boomers retire. And so that high demand and tight supply means that wages per worker should go up. And so we forecast modest or moderate growth in total wages across the whole economy, but because our labor supply is tight, that means that individual workers are expected to have higher wages. And so at the U.S. level, which is where the consumer spending forecast comes from, those higher wages support higher consumer spending.
But you also mentioned that businesses are not growing at the rate that maybe we would like. What's holding them back? Yeah,
so that business investment forecast, so that has to do with, it's called business fixed investment, and it's business purchases of equipment, of buildings, of intellectual property, and that has slowed down. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is manufacturing has slowed down. In the U.S., there has been a decline in manufacturing employment, and that has been hit by the trade war. And so trade policy uncertainty has affected the manufacturing sector, and it has consequently affected business investment. It also has to do with the strong U.S. dollar. So as the dollar is stronger, that means that our goods are more expensive for our overseas customers, and so demand for U.S. exports slows down. So those are the things that are slowing manufacturing and are slowing business investment.
So if things with the trade policy would be resolved, you would expect then manufacturing to reverse and start to grow again?
Yeah, that would be upside potential to this U.S. forecast, would be if all of this trade policy uncertainty, which is slowing things for businesses, if that were lifted and they actually know what the trade policy playing field looks like, then they might invest in expansion that they aren't right now. So right now, trade policy uncertainty is causing firms to hold off. Like, I don't know exactly who my suppliers are going to be. I don't know whether there's going to be a tariff on my goods when I ship them to another country. And so I'm going to hold off and not expand yet. But if all of that uncertainty goes away, if we have trade agreements that clarify the law going forward, then businesses may well pick up.
And it's been reported that the uncertainty in trade policy has really dampened farming, agriculture in the state as well. Would you expect more certainty in trade to reverse that? And how specifically is ag being affected in Minnesota? Yeah, so all of the trade exposed industries, manufacturing, logistics, agriculture, those are all facing this uncertainty. And for agriculture, it has been particularly problematic, the relationship between the U.S. and China. So China was a large purchaser of U.S. soybeans. It's a large purchaser of U.S. pork. We also have had, in the last couple of years, policy uncertainty with regard to Canada and Mexico, which are our largest trading partners in Minnesota. And so when there's uncertainty about whether a country is going to allow those exports, for instance, when China says we're not going to purchase U.S. soybeans, then that significantly impacts the farmers who produce those commodities here in Minnesota. And it has been a number, the trade war with China came at a time when net farm incomes had been declining for several years following really high commodity prices in 2012, 2013. And so it came at a really rough time for farmers that were dealing with the declining prices. They could certainly see a change in their fortunes. One noteworthy item is that domestic migration has reversed. It has improved. 15 years of decline, and now more people are moving to Minnesota than are leaving. Another positive note is the increase in household formations. So what is driving those two changes? Yeah, so yes, net domestic immigration is now positive for Minnesota, meaning that for 17 and 18, the two most recent years of data, we gained more people from other states than we lost. And household formation, what that means is that when you have people living together in a household and then they separate, that creates a household. So a household can form because a new household moved into the state, or because people who have been living together in order to save costs, for instance, separate and create new households. Both of those things, I think, are the result of a strong economy and good jobs in Minnesota. So people look from around the country and around the world, looking for, where do I want to live, work, start a business, raise my family? Well, in a state where the budget is in good shape and there's a strong demand for jobs and average wages are increasing, not at gangbuster rates, but faster than the U.S. rate, then it looks like a great place to move to. And with regarding household formations, you usually expect to see formations to increase as the economy improves following a recession. So during a recession, people move together to save on money. Your kid graduates from college and they don't move into their apartment, they move into your basement. And then as the economy improves, people separate. But household formations didn't pick up as much during this expansion as was expected. Early on, you mean? Early on, and right. It is now. Right, and so it's not so much surprising that we got a spike in household formations in the recent data. What's surprising is that we didn't get it sooner. But now we have it. We're out of time. Dr. Kalambokidis, I want to thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in February. Sure. Human Services Commissioner Jodi Harpstead presented her 90-day review of the department to a key Senate committee.
Very much. There's nothing more important for the Minnesota Department of Human Services than to be trustworthy for the people of Minnesota, the over 1 million people we support to live in community, and all taxpayers.
I think it's important for members of this committee and for the stakeholders that attend hearings and are watching the Department of Human Services to understand that this 90 days was the first mile of a marathon, and it is going to take a long time to establish the trustworthiness, to make accountability and transparency the watchwords of operations. And so I was grateful to see that in your report.
I'm just wondering if you could address how breaking up a department into, let's say, two departments will actually help do that very hard work of making sure every dollar, every dime, every penny is spent not only as intended, but in the most effective and efficient manner.
Chair Benson and
Commissioner
Senator
Harpstead.
Nelson, that's a good question. And that's one of the arguments on the side of not breaking up the department. There are other arguments on the side of making it smaller, perhaps that people could just focus on part of the work and be more intentional about that part of the work. But that's a good question too, and whether size is the issue or these process controls that we have laid out is the issue, and should we do both or just focus one at a time? So those are all good questions, and that's the issue at hand.
I'm just bringing a message to you from Anoka County. They're not paying. They just wanted me to let you know that. And so the real question on this is which taxpayer is going to pay?
Of course, the same kinds of questions apply to the tribal overpayment, and another problem to solve. And I understand on the tribal side, we have a potential legislative, a potential judicial, and a potential administrative approach to the problem. So my next step is to go fully understand the forecast and budget implications of each of those paths, and then we'll need to talk about how do we solve these problems.
I think if there's any word that I've enjoyed hearing in the last month, that's, you just said together. I think there has not been a sense of together.
The Department of Human Services has garnered troubling headlines over the last months, prompting lawmakers to review how that agency and other agencies are spending taxpayer money. Senate Finance Chair Julie Rosen joins me now to offer her assessment of the budget forecast and what steps lawmakers can take to ensure fiscal integrity among state agencies. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. It's great to be here.
Let's begin with the budget forecast projected to be $1.3 billion. Not to mention the budget reserve now has reached $2.3 billion, which was its target. Is this good news to you?
Oh, this is very good news. I believe the budget reserve and having a nice cash balance and a healthy surplus means that we are doing some proper things in Minnesota. We have a low debt service. We have a pension reform bill that was outstanding. We've done some stress testing on our revenue. We need to do some stress testing on our spending. So we've done some good precautionary things. I'd like to actually thank Senator Skoye and Senator Cohen for that budget reserve concept of 33% of any surplus needs to go into a surplus. And it's a great mechanism, and we've utilized that very well. So we're at the very highest that we've ever been, and I think it's a good space, but we shouldn't be thinking that we're going to go spending a lot of money or get very crazy with our budget. It's not the time to do that.
In remarks following the forecast, you pointed out that there was a 6.6% increase in the budget last year. The forecast does not, in most instances, account for inflation. So we have a surplus, but there will be inflation. Would you like to see this change happen in the budget forecast where inflation is calculated in so that, you know, if it looks like we have a surplus, there's the understanding that that's not free money to be spent, that really, you know, once you calculate for inflation, it's not so big?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, it's a concept that we can look at, but I don't believe that things should be on autopilot. And frankly, if it was a concept that should have been done, the Democrats could have done that back in 13-14 when they had the governor in the House and the Senate. So I think just it gives us the ability to really take a good look at our budget going forward, and I would like to keep it the way it is.
But in general, going forward, you're cautious, but you're satisfied with the fiscal health of the state right now.
I am, because as I said, we have a lot of good things going for us. We have a mixed industrial manufacturing market. I think that's strong. We have low unemployment, lower than the United States average, and you know, we have some a strong workforce. We are doing the proper things when it comes to education, but we do have some problems, and I don't think we need to increase any of our obligations on more fixed costs, any more new programs. Let's take up care of the responsibilities that we have. And we really need to start asking our agencies, our departments, to really come forward with the accountability on what they are spending. And we keep talking about this, but it's time to demand it now. There's going to be a lot more arguing. Whenever you have a surplus, There's a lot more arguing than when there's a deficit.
Right, and you're jumping into my very next question, which is, as chair of the Finance Committee, you've said that there's going to be a deep dive into all agency spending to see where the money is going. You held a hearing last month following the news that the Department of Human Services had more than 200 violations of contract law within the last year. So before we get into more details, what did you take away from that hearing?
Oh, that it was, I am appalled when I go to the gas station and the number one thing is, please don't give me a gas tax. And the number two thing is, what is going on at the Capitol with the Department of Human Services? These are average working people, and they are attuned to what's happening with this agency. And I'm frankly, and we are all frankly fatigued at this upheaval that they've shown. They are unaccountable for many areas. I'm hoping Commissioner Harpstead can tear it apart and pull it back together, but it is there's actually about $130.5 million of unaccounted money that DHS has to pay back or has had some problems with and has to pay back to the federal government. $130.5 million. What can we do with that money? You think about that. And this is just one of the mistakes. So every morning you wake up and you go, what else is going to happen with DHS? And we found from that hearing in the Senate Finance Committee that the state contract and the way they allocate money is a problem in all the other agencies. So there's a very much of a shoot from the hip kind of attitude towards state money, state taxpayers' money. And that's a problem. So I'm going to be asking, and the chairs will be asking, for more accountability. Can you show us the results? And are you spending the dollars well that come from the Minnesota taxpayers?
And so from your vantage point as Finance Chair, you want this to be an ongoing conversation, not just with the Department of Human Services, but with all state agencies.
Absolutely.
Just please explain how you're spending money and account for it.
Can you do it better? Can you join forces? How are you spending it with federal dollars coming in or county dollars coming in? Is there a collaboration? I always call it the big white board sitting in Health and Human Services. We have no idea how many programs there are and what type of funding is coming to those programs, and can we do better than what we have? Some pay for performance ideas. You get the money after you show that you have had some results that you said you were going to deliver. So there's a lot of different concepts, but frankly, I passed a pay for performance bill, and it never has been implemented back in 2012. And that's a problem too. We have some great initiatives on the books in law, and especially Department of Human Services has not implemented them, and it's getting to be a problem.
Just a couple other questions I have for you. You're talking about overpayments. There were overpayments of federal dollars in the Department of Human Services for substance abuse treatment that went to 2 tribes and also to the counties. State law currently asks the state to claw back those dollars. The counties say they can't afford it. The tribes also can't afford it. And both are saying we did nothing wrong. First, should that clawback provision be changed? And second, do you think the surplus money that we have currently would be a good use to put towards this problem?
Well, I'm going to be very cautious about expectations on where to spend the surplus money. That is not the finance chair's job, is to say what it should be allocated for, except I'd probably like to save more. But I do agree with the tribes. It was not their fault. And I do believe that there should be some assistance, and it should come out of the budget of the Department of Human Services and not from the state coffers or the taxpayers. As the author of the opioid bill, the Native American tribes have been decimated with some substance abuse issues. And so we need to help them as much as we possibly can, but just letting Department of Human Services off on this, I cannot support that.
For some time, there's been talk of splitting up the Department of Human Services. You've suggested also that the Inspector General's office should not be under DHS, but should be separated. The current new commissioner, DHS Commissioner Harpstead, told a key House committee that Governor Walz will have a plan or offer some suggestions in coming days, but she's concerned that splitting the department won't necessarily bring cost savings. What is your perspective?
And I understand there is something coming out at the end of the week from the governor, so I'm anxious to maybe get a heads up early. That would be nice. My perspective is that it's not necessarily about cost savings. It's about integrity and doing the job right and showing some accountability. If there's cost savings in the end, that's wonderful, but we need to be able to have a department that people can depend on, believe in, and that are showing results. And if it costs money, so be it.
Senator Rosen, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Always. Thank you very much, Shannon.
Members of the Senate DFL announced the formation of a Clean Energy Caucus.
You know, the governor has laid out a very bold initiative on clean energy. And so we are bringing as many people together in our caucus as we can to start that conversation of how we can accomplish that. We've seen thousands of people come to the Capitol here over the last legislative session urging us to make this issue a priority. And as I just kind of personally reflect on it, I've thought about the fact that, you know, the future is really not mine, but the future does belong to my grandchildren.
If your house was on fire, wouldn't you want to start by asking how badly the fire is burning before arguing about the cost of the fire hoses? What we need to do in the Minnesota Senate is hold hearings on the causes and effects in climate change. What are we afraid of? Let's find out what the truth is. Let's drill down and do what we do best in the legislature, which is bring witnesses forward from the community. As a DFLer from North Mankato, I very much want to advance the notion that this is good policy for greater Minnesota. We want wind and solar arrays on Minnesota farms. We want to create a tax base in our rural counties that promotes the quality of life outside of the metro area. And we want those jobs and those families to be happy to live and work communities just like mine, whether they're 50 miles from the metro or 250.
The Minnesota State Building and Construction Trades Council supports policies that meet the energy needs of today and help us build toward a clean energy future by advocating for the expansion of renewable energy, power storage, energy efficiency, and innovative technologies. The building trades believe that climate change must be addressed, that investments must be made in operations, maintenance, and repair of Minnesota's energy infrastructure. Investments must be made in the development and deployment of technologies like solar, wind, hydroelectric, carbon capture and utilization, battery storage, and low-carbon electrified transportation. Minnesota building trades believe that investments must be made to increase energy efficiency in industrial, commercial, and residential buildings, to retrofit our schools and our public buildings to make our communities safe and resilient.
We don't need to choose between the planet and the economy. Minnesotans export $18 billion of our own money to import fuels like natural gas and coal. We should reinvest those dollars in the state.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.